Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'm going to be covering the weather for May 22nd of 2023. What we're currently looking at is a slight risk setup for the Texas Panhandle, as well as a marginal threat going down from the border of Kansas and Oklahoma into Mexico, as well as an additional marginal threat for central Montana, as well as a marginal threat for the Florida Peninsula going into the deep southern United States. Um, as for our threats, we do have a very small tornado potential, very marginal 2% tornado threat, as well as a 15% for that slight risk area for damaging winds, on top of a 5%, as well as a small 15% on top of a 5% for hail, as well as a 5% for the marginal threat in the Florida marginal risk and a 5% for the Montana marginal risk, and we do have a 5% in damaging winds for the Montana marginal threat and a 5% damaging wind threat for the marginal Florida Peninsula marginal threat. Taking a look at our pivotal weather models here, starting off with the mid-level flow here, there's not a notable low-level trough that is moving through the area, but we do have a surface very weak lee troughing through the deep southwestern Kansas area that should initiate some westward flow to initiate some storm development throughout the Texas Panhandle, as well as for the marginal threat down through Montana. We do have that low pressure system ejecting some mid-level winds throughout much of the area down into central Montana. Likely was going to be our main trigger for severe weather in central Montana. And our main trigger for severe weather down here, down south in the Florida Peninsula, is mostly going to be sea breezes. But I'm going to be focusing more on the Florida or Texas Panhandle threat more than the Montana and Florida threat. Moving down to our 700 millibars here, there's not really all that much notable low-level flow, either in the Montana threat or the Texas Panhandle threat. Although we do have a very small amount of low-level flow, it is likely not going to impact the storm threat through central Montana all that much. It's likely going to make a lot of our storm systems that we see in central Montana mostly mid-level to upper-level based, as well as create the potential for some mid-level wind shear and potentially some upper-level wind shear without the presence of low-level wind shear. And that goes for both Florida, the Texas Panhandle, and the Montana threat. And then moving on to the dew points here, let's start off with the Texas Panhandle. You can see that surface trough there where we had those deeper deeper dew points in the 60s, and then widespread 50 dew points along a converging boundary with much deeper or much less dew points, less humid air. It's likely not going to be effective of the storm development all that much because it is not an intense dry line at all that is being forced that is forcing storm development. However, these dew points here is going to be likely to allow for the fueling of storm development. But then let's move to the central Montana marginal threat. You can see that throughout much of that area there is very weak dew points to begin with, barely breaking 50 at all, mainly staying in the 40s. And then you can see continuing forward as storms continue, you can see rain humidified and rain cooled air triggering dew points that are going to get into the 50s. This is likely not going to be much of a fueling factor for storm development and is likely going to inhibit a very strong instability through Montana. But then let's move down to the Florida marginal threat. You can see very strong dew points in the 70s as well as dew points in the 60s in some areas, but mainly dew points in the 70s. Is going to be more than enough to fuel storm development alongside any instability. Taking a look at our instability here, first let's start off with Montana. You can see that expected with very weak humidity, there is very weak instability here with cave values, mixed layer cave values that are barely exceeding 500, likely to help not only fuel storm development and prolong it, but also to help maybe allow for the potential for some very small to medium-sized hail. But then if we take a look at the Texas Panhandle, we do have more instability down here with Cape values that are in the very moderates to lows, which is going to allow for the potential for large hail. But then let's move down to the marginal threat in the Florida Panhandle. We do have some instability that is in the moderates again, and going into possibly even the 2000s in some areas. Also going to allow for the potential for some large hail to develop, and as well as fuel storm development. Taking a look at our lapse rates here, let's start off with the Texas Panhandle. We do have some very strong lapse rates that are moving in from New Mexico, which is going to mix up that humidity and the instability and get it ready for storm development, as well as the how strong these lapse rates are also likely going to allow for more explosive storm systems. But then let's move to central Montana here. You see strong lapse rates, which could help mix up any instability and humidity, whatever very small amounts we have of it, and allow for some less explosive storm developments because the humidity and instability isn't as intense through Texas, but it is still sufficient for storm development. However, it is again expected to be much weaker. But then let's take a look at Florida here. Keep in mind, storm development through Florida is likely going to be mainly triggered by sea breezes. We hardly see any strong lapse rates down through Florida, through the Florida Peninsula, which is likely going to possibly inhibit storm development a little bit. The deep level humidity and the instability should allow for storm development. Taking a look at our low-level wind shear here, let's start off with the Texas Panhandle. You can see some strong wind shear, some sufficient wind shear behind the storm systems. The storm line is right here. This is all strong wind shear that develops behind the storm line, which is going to make it possibly unusable to any storms that have already passed through the area, and likely inhibiting the tornado threat in the Texas Panhandle. However, you can still see a little bit of wind shear attached to those storm systems, which could allow for some very small amount of tornadic development, as well as this wind shear that is behind the storm systems could possibly be used by the storm systems, but I'm finding it unlikely. But then let's move to the central Montana marginal threat. You can see that there is pretty much no low level wind shear here, which is going to make low level rotation pretty much unlikely. So in a second, I will switch to the mid levels to take a look at mid level and upper level wind shear and see show you guys how most supercells that could develop are likely going to be more mid level based. Taking a look at the mid-level based wind shear here, let's start off with the Texas Panhandle. You can see after storm development, you can see the line of storms being right here. You can see some mid-level wind shear and upper-level wind shear associated with these storms, which could allow for some mid-level rotation in any long-track supercells that could develop. But then let's take a look at the central Montana threat. You can see throughout much of that marginal threat, you can see that there is fairly weak mid-level wind shear here, which is going to make tornadic development very unlikely. Taking a look at our surface instability, though, let's start off with the Texas Panhandle again. You can see that for the surface instability, there is sufficient surface instability through that surface lee trough there, or mid-level lee trough, and continuing forward as storms continue, there is hardly any surface instability at all to help to likely not allow for any strong updrafts and allow for tornadic genesis, which surface instability is a key part in tornadic development. but as well as but with the wind shear, possible mid-level rotation, but without the surface instability, it is likely unlikely. But then let's move to the central Montana threat. You can see with that very weak mid-level wind shear, you can see practically no surface instability either. So tornadic genesis in these two regions is going to be very, very unlikely. Then, to tie it all together, let's take a look at SIGTOR. As I've said every single video so far, this is not something you want to rely on. You want to look at the entire spectrum of ingredients for an accurate representation of tornadic possibilities. So let's take a look at the Texas Panhandle. You can see very, very weak tornadic signatures for the Texas Panhandle because the ingredients there are just not good enough for very strong very strong tornadic development, as wind shear, low-level wind shear is very weak, as well as surface instability being two key parts for storm development, or tornadic development, I should say. But then let's take a look at the Marshall threat for central Montana. Sorry if I keep calling it Minnesota this video. You can see absolutely no, or there are a little bits of signatures, but it is very unlikely that we're going to see tornadoes up through that area. But what's interesting is that there is more signatures for on SIGTOR for tornadoes through the Florida Panhandle with those ingredients than there are in Texas, despite there not being a 2% threat for issued by the SPC for the Florida Panhandle. So or Florida Peninsula, which is what I find interesting. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. That being our main hub for any Project Gladiator events, socials, and anything Project Gladiator related is going to be in the Discord. So thank you for watching today's video, and hopefully I will be back tomorrow with another forecast.